Field Marshal Fedor von Bock stood in his Army Group Center headquarters on the evening of December 16, 1941, staring at the situation maps that showed his forces being systematically destroyed by Soviet counterattacks all along the front, stretching from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. And he understood with absolute clarity that unless he received permission to conduct an immediate tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions approximately 100 kilometers west of Moscow, his entire army group would cease to exist as a functional fighting force within 2 to 3 weeks at most. The situation was deteriorating hour by hour as fresh Soviet divisions continued arriving from Siberia and the Far East to join the counteroffensive that Marshal Georgy Zhukov had launched on December 5th, while German units were being ground down through a combination of fierce enemy attacks, catastrophic equipment failures caused by extreme cold, and complete breakdown of logistics systems that could no longer deliver adequate food, fuel, and ammunition to frontline troops who were now fighting as much for survival against the elements as against the Red Army. Von Bock had commanded Army Group Center since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, leading the central thrust of the German invasion that had driven over 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory and come within 30 kilometers of Moscow before being stopped by Soviet resistance and the onset of winter conditions that his forces were completely unprepared to handle. He was a professional soldier with 4 decades of military service dating back to the First World War, a Prussian officer of the old school who understood military necessity and tactical realities, and every instinct and every piece of training told him that the correct response to the current situation was an orderly withdrawal to positions where his forces could establish defensible lines with adequate shelter and supply connections, allowing them to survive the winter and rebuild their strength for renewed offensive operations in spring when weather conditions would favor German tactical and technological advantages. But Adolf Hitler had made his position absolutely clear during multiple telephone conversations and written directives over the previous 10 days, repeatedly stating that no withdrawal of any kind would be permitted regardless of tactical circumstances or casualty rates, that every German soldier must hold his current position to the last man and last bullet, and that any commander who ordered retreat without explicit authorization from the Führer himself would be immediately relieved of command and face court-martial for cowardice and defeatism. Hitler's reasoning, such as it was, combined his personal World War I experiences in the trenches where he had witnessed the catastrophic collapse of the German Western Front in autumn 1918, with his ideological conviction that willpower and determination could overcome material disadvantages, leading him to conclude that any withdrawal would trigger a general rout comparable to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812, and that the only way to prevent total disaster was to forbid all retreat and force German soldiers to fight where they stood, regardless of consequences. Von Bock drafted yet another carefully worded message to Hitler's headquarters, requesting authorization for tactical withdrawals in sectors where Soviet breakthrough threatened to encircle large German formations, arguing with all the professional expertise he could marshal that permitting limited withdrawals now would save tens of thousands of men who would be lost if units were forced to remain in exposed positions that had become death traps due to Soviet numerical superiority and German logistical collapse. He explained that his forces were suffering over 5,000 casualties per day from combat and cold-related injuries combined, that entire divisions had been reduced to regimental strength or less, that ammunition supplies were critically low, with some units down to less than 1 day's basic load, that food rations had been cut to starvation levels, providing barely 1,500 calories per day, and that the cold weather was inflicting more casualties than enemy action, with thousands of frostbite cases requiring immediate medical evacuation that the overwhelmed medical system could not provide. The response from Hitler's headquarters came back within hours, delivered by teletype in language that left no room for interpretation or negotiation. All positions would be held. No withdrawals would be permitted under any circumstances. Commanders who could not hold their positions would be replaced by officers who possessed the necessary determination and willpower. And any further requests for permission to withdraw would be considered evidence of defeatism, requiring immediate relief from command. Hitler had spoken, and in the Third Reich, when the Führer gave an order, that order was law regardless of whether it made any military sense or would result in unnecessary casualties that could have been prevented through rational tactical decisions based on actual battlefield conditions rather than ideological fantasies about the power of will to overcome material reality. Von Bock understood in that moment that he faced an impossible choice between obeying orders that he knew with absolute certainty would result in the destruction of his army group and disobeying orders in order to save his men, knowing that disobedience would end his career and possibly his life, but might preserve the fighting strength of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who would otherwise die or be captured in a senseless last stand dictated by a political leader with no real understanding of military operations or the actual conditions facing troops on the Eastern Front during the worst winter in over a century. He was 61 years old, had spent most of his adult life in military service, had risen to the highest levels of command in the German armed forces, and now found himself having to choose between professional duty to his soldiers and obedience to a supreme commander whose orders violated every principle of sound military leadership. General Heinz Guderian, commander of 2nd Panzer Army on the southern flank of the Moscow front, was simultaneously wrestling with the exact same dilemma as von Bock, having watched his armored forces systematically destroyed during the past 2 weeks by a combination of Soviet attacks, mechanical breakdowns caused by extreme cold, and fuel shortages that left hundreds of tanks immobilized even when their engines could still function. Guderian was the father of German panzer tactics, the officer who had pioneered the use of massed armor formations, conducting deep penetration operations supported by air power and motorized infantry. And he understood better than almost anyone in the German military that panzer forces were offensive weapons designed for mobile warfare and completely unsuited for static defensive operations in winter conditions where their mobility advantage was negated by weather and terrain. Guderian had been requesting permission to withdraw his panzer army to positions behind the Oka River, where defensive lines could be established with better supply connections, and where his remaining tanks could be concentrated for potential counterattacks, rather than being scattered along hundreds of kilometers of front line, where they were being picked off one by Soviet anti-tank weapons and destroyed by cold weather that froze lubricants and cracked engine blocks. His requests had been denied repeatedly by Hitler's headquarters, with increasingly threatening language suggesting that Guderian's judgment was being questioned, and that continued requests for withdrawal authorization might result in his relief from command for lacking the necessary offensive spirit and determination to hold positions against enemy pressure. On December 26th, Guderian made the decision to fly personally to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to present his case directly to the Führer, hoping that face-to-face conversation might succeed where written and telephone communications had failed. The meeting was a disaster from the moment Guderian began explaining the actual situation facing 2nd Panzer Army, with Hitler interrupting repeatedly to lecture Guderian about willpower and determination while refusing to engage with any of the factual information about casualties, equipment losses, or logistical breakdown that Guderian presented. When Guderian persisted in his argument that tactical withdrawals were militarily necessary to prevent the complete destruction of his forces, Hitler's response was to relieve Guderian of command effective immediately and order him to return to Germany on indefinite leave, ending the career of one of Germany's most successful and innovative military commanders, because he had dared to tell Hitler the truth about battlefield conditions and request authorization for tactical decisions that any competent military leader would have recognized as obviously necessary. General Erich Hoepner, commander of 4th Panzer Group northeast of Moscow, made a similar tactical decision when faced with Soviet breakthroughs that threatened to encircle major portions of his forces, ordering a withdrawal of approximately 40 kilometers to new defensive positions despite having received explicit orders from Hitler's headquarters forbidding any retreat. Hoepner was a highly experienced armor commander who had participated in every major German offensive since the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and he made his decision based on purely military considerations regarding the survival of his command and the preservation of combat power that could be used for future operations. His withdrawal succeeded in saving several divisions from encirclement and destruction, but the price for this military success was immediate relief from command. Formal court-martial proceedings for disobedience of orders in wartime, and cashiering from the armed forces with loss of all pension rights and military honors earned during nearly 4 decades of service. Hitler's reaction to Hoepner's tactical withdrawal went beyond simple relief from command and represented a deliberate decision to make an example of a senior officer who had prioritized military necessity over blind obedience to orders that made no tactical sense. The court-martial proceedings against Hoepner were conducted with the explicit purpose of sending a message to every other German general that disobedience would not be tolerated regardless of the military justification for such disobedience. And while Hoepner avoided execution, the public humiliation of a general officer being stripped of rank and honors served Hitler's purpose of intimidating other commanders into absolute obedience, even when their professional judgment told them that Hitler's orders were militarily unsound and would result in unnecessary casualties. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South in Ukraine, had already been relieved of command in early December after requesting permission to withdraw from exposed positions around Rostov-on-Don, where his forces were being pounded by Soviet counterattacks, in conditions similar to those facing Army Group Center around Moscow. Von Rundstedt was one of Germany's most senior and respected military commanders, a Prussian aristocrat with impeccable military credentials dating back to service in the First World War, and his relief from command shocked the entire officer corps because it demonstrated that even the most prestigious commanders were not immune from Hitler's wrath if they questioned his orders or requested tactical flexibility in response to battlefield developments. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commander of Army Group North besieging Leningrad, would be relieved of command in January 1942 after requesting permission to shorten his lines and withdraw from exposed salients where his forces were suffering heavy casualties from Soviet attacks and winter conditions. Von Lieb's relief followed the same pattern as von Rundstedt's, with Hitler responding to requests for tactical flexibility by removing commanders and replacing them with officers who would follow orders without question, regardless of the military consequences of such obedience. The systematic relief of Germany's most experienced and capable field commanders during the winter crisis of 1941 through 42 represented a catastrophic self-inflicted wound that would have long-term consequences for German military effectiveness on the Eastern Front and throughout the remainder of the war. Hitler was essentially purging his own command structure of officers who possessed the professional expertise and independent judgment necessary for successful military operations, replacing them with yes-men who would obey orders but who lacked the moral courage to tell Hitler when his decisions were wrong or the professional competence to make sound tactical judgments when battlefield conditions demanded flexibility and initiative. General Franz Halder, Chief of the German Army General Staff and the highest-ranking professional military officer in the Wehrmacht, watched this purge of field commanders with growing alarm and recognized that Hitler was destroying the German military tradition of delegating tactical authority to commanders on the scene who could respond to local conditions without waiting for approval from higher headquarters that might be hundreds of kilometers away, and operating with incomplete or outdated information about actual battlefield situations. Halder had been advocating for strategic withdrawals and consolidation of German forces into more defensible positions since early December, arguing that attempting to hold every meter of ground during winter would result in catastrophic casualties and permanent damage to the combat effectiveness of forces that would be needed for future operations. But Hitler had rejected all such arguments and was now demonstrating through his relief of field commanders that professional military advice would not be tolerated if it conflicted with his personal convictions about the necessity of holding positions regardless of cost. The number of senior German officers relieved of command during December 1941 and January 1942 eventually reached 35, including 3 field marshals, 8 army commanders, and dozens of corps and division commanders who were removed either for requesting permission to withdraw or for actually conducting withdrawals without authorization when they judged that their forces would be destroyed if they remained in exposed positions. This purge represented approximately 1/3 of all senior command positions in the German army on the Eastern Front, creating massive disruption in command relationships and forcing hastily promoted replacement officers to take over in the middle of the worst crisis the Wehrmacht had faced since its creation, resulting in further deterioration of German combat effectiveness, as inexperienced commanders struggled to master situations that would have been difficult even for veterans with years of experience at their current command levels. Hitler's stand-fast order, despite its catastrophic impact on German command structure, and despite the enormous casualties suffered by units forced to remain in exposed positions, did achieve one significant result that Hitler would later cite as justification for his policy. The German front did not collapse completely as it might have if panicked withdrawals had been permitted without any central control or coordination. The comparison to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812, which had degenerated into a disorganized rout, with hundreds of thousands of French soldiers dying during the chaotic withdrawal, provided Hitler with a historical precedent that seemed to validate his insistence on holding positions even when tactical wisdom dictated withdrawal. Though professional military historians would later point out that the situations were fundamentally different and that controlled tactical withdrawals under German command would not have resulted in anything comparable to Napoleon's catastrophe. The psychological impact of the winter crisis and Hitler's response to it fundamentally altered the relationship between Hitler and his military commanders, establishing a pattern of distrust and micromanagement that would characterize German military operations for the remainder of the war. Officers who had once enjoyed considerable autonomy and tactical decision-making now found themselves operating under constant scrutiny and having to request approval for even routine operational decisions, while Hitler increasingly involved himself in details that should have been left to commanders on the ground, who could assess local situations and respond appropriately without waiting for guidance from a supreme commander, who was often operating with incomplete information and whose decisions were frequently influenced more by ideological considerations than military necessity. General Günther von Kluge, who replaced von Bock as commander of Army Group Center in December 1941, quickly learned that his primary function was not to command his forces in accordance with sound military principles, but rather to implement Hitler's orders, regardless of whether those orders made any tactical sense. Von Kluge had been selected for this position specifically because he was considered more politically reliable than von Bock, and more willing to follow orders without questioning them, and he spent the remainder of the winter campaign attempting to execute impossible missions with inadequate resources while pretending to Hitler's headquarters that the situation was under control even when it clearly was not, establishing a pattern of deception and wishful thinking that would plague German military operations throughout the remainder of the war, as commanders learned that telling Hitler the truth about battlefield conditions would result in relief from command, while presenting optimistic assessments might preserve their positions, even if such assessments bore no relationship to actual circumstances. The German Ninth Army under General Adolf Strauss provided a stark example of the human cost of Hitler's stand-fast order when it lost over 60,000 men during the final 2 weeks of December 1941. While attempting to hold positions that were clearly untenable against Soviet attacks, supported by overwhelming numbers of fresh troops equipped for winter warfare. Strauss had requested permission multiple times to conduct tactical withdrawals to more defensible lines where his forces could be adequately supplied and sheltered. But each request was denied by Hitler's headquarters with increasingly threatening language about the consequences of defeatism. The result was that entire divisions of Ninth Army were destroyed in place, their soldiers dying from combat wounds, hypothermia, and starvation, while holding positions that had no strategic value and whose loss would not have significantly altered the overall military situation, but whose retention had become a matter of personal prestige for Hitler, who could not tolerate any admission that his forces were being pushed back by an enemy he had consistently described as racially and militarily inferior. The Fourth Army northeast of Moscow faced similar circumstances when Soviet breakthroughs threatened to encircle large portions of the army that were still deployed in forward salients, extending toward Moscow's northern suburbs. The army commander requested permission to pull back these endangered units to positions behind natural defensive barriers where they could establish continuous lines and receive adequate supplies, but Hitler personally intervened to forbid any withdrawal and ordered that forward positions be held regardless of whether they were surrounded or cut off from supply lines. The result was that several divisions of Fourth Army were indeed encircled and spent weeks fighting in complete isolation while consuming their remaining ammunition and food supplies, with many units being forced to surrender or being destroyed when they attempted unauthorized breakouts after their situations became completely hopeless. The commanders who obeyed Hitler's stand-fast order without question faced their own moral and professional dilemmas as they watched their forces being systematically destroyed while following orders they knew to be militarily senseless. Some of these commanders suffered psychological breakdowns under the stress of commanding units in impossible situations, while others developed elaborate rationalizations for why obedience to obviously wrong orders was nonetheless the correct course of action, because military discipline required following the chain of command, even when that chain of command was making catastrophic errors. The German military tradition had always emphasized obedience to superior authority as a fundamental virtue, but that tradition had developed in an era when superior officers were assumed to be competent professionals who would make sound military decisions based on actual battlefield conditions. And the tradition was never intended to cover situations where political leaders with no real military expertise were issuing operationally unsound orders based on ideological conviction rather than tactical necessity. General Walter Model, who would later become one of Hitler's favorite commanders precisely because of his willingness to execute impossible missions without complaining about inadequate resources or requesting permission to make tactical adjustments, emerged during the winter crisis as the prototype of the kind of officer Hitler preferred. Absolutely loyal, completely obedient, willing to attack regardless of odds, and capable of presenting optimistic assessments, even when situations were clearly deteriorating. Model's rise through the command hierarchy during the winter of 1941 through 42 demonstrated to other ambitious officers that the path to advancement lay not in professional competence or sound military judgment, but rather in unquestioning obedience to Hitler's orders and willingness to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than uncomfortable truths about actual battlefield conditions. The purge of German commanders during the winter crisis had profound implications for civil-military relations in Nazi Germany and helped establish Hitler's absolute authority over military operations that would characterize the remainder of the war. Prior to winter 1941, there had still been some residual tension between Hitler and his professional military advisors regarding strategic and operational decisions, with generals sometimes succeeding in modifying or delaying Hitler's plans when they could present compelling military arguments for alternative courses of action. After the Winter Purge, such disagreements became increasingly impossible because Hitler had demonstrated that he would not tolerate dissent from military professionals and would respond to disagreement by removing officers and replacing them with more compliant subordinates who understood that their positions depended on pleasing Hitler rather than on sound military performance. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces and Hitler's primary military advisor, had long since abandoned any pretense of providing independent military counsel and functioned primarily as a transmitter of Hitler's orders to the field commanders who were expected to implement them without question. Keitel's complete subservience to Hitler earned him the contemptuous nickname La Keitel, a pun combining his name with the German word for lackey, among other German officers who recognized that he had betrayed the professional military tradition of providing honest advice to political leaders, even when that advice conflicted with the leader's preferences. But Keitel's survival in his position while more competent and independent officers were being relieved provided a clear lesson about what behaviors were rewarded and what behaviors were punished in Hitler's Third Reich. And ambitious officers learned to emulate Keitel's sycophancy rather than the professional integrity of commanders like Guderian, who had dared to tell Hitler uncomfortable truths and had paid for their honesty with their careers. The Winter Crisis also marked the beginning of Hitler's increasing paranoia about potential disloyalty among his military commanders, leading him to interpret any request for tactical flexibility or any expression of concern about battlefield conditions as evidence of defeatism or even treason. This paranoia would intensify throughout the war and would reach its culmination in the aftermath of the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, when Hitler would order the execution of hundreds of military officers suspected of involvement in the plot or of harboring sympathies for the conspirators. But the roots of this paranoia can be traced back to the winter of 1941, when Hitler first became convinced that his generals were not sufficiently committed to victory and were looking for excuses to avoid fighting, rather than pressing attacks with the necessary ruthlessness and determination. The long-term consequences of Hitler's Winter Purge extended far beyond the immediate impact on command relationships and operational effectiveness during the winter campaign itself. By systematically removing experienced commanders and replacing them with officers selected primarily for political reliability rather than military competence, Hitler ensured that the German military would become progressively less effective as the war continued and as the Wehrmacht faced increasingly difficult strategic situations requiring exactly the kind of flexible and innovative thinking that Hitler's command style actively discouraged. The officers who survived and prospered under Hitler's system were those who had learned to suppress their professional judgment and simply implement Hitler's orders regardless of whether those orders made military sense, creating a command culture that was fundamentally incompatible with the complex operational requirements of modern warfare on multiple fronts against opponents who possessed superior resources and growing military competence. The contrast between German and Soviet command structures during the winter of 1941 provides an instructive comparison that helps explain the ultimate outcome of the war on the Eastern Front. Stalin, despite being every bit as tyrannical and paranoid as Hitler, had learned from the catastrophic defeats of summer and autumn 1941 that he needed to delegate more authority to professional military commanders like Zhukov, who understood warfare and could make sound tactical decisions without constant interference from political leadership. While Stalin certainly made his share of strategic errors and sometimes overruled his generals' advice, he gradually developed a working relationship with his military commanders that allowed them considerable operational flexibility within the framework of strategic objectives set by the political leadership. And this flexibility proved essential for Soviet success in conducting the complex multi-front campaigns that would eventually drive German forces back to Berlin. Hitler moved in exactly the opposite direction, becoming increasingly involved in tactical details that should have been left to commanders on the scene, and frequently overruling sound military advice in favor of decisions based on political considerations or personal whims that had no basis in military reality. The Winter Purge of 1941 through 42 established this pattern of Hitler's micromanagement and the general's learned helplessness, and this dysfunctional command relationship would plague German military operations for the remainder of the war, contributing significantly to defeats that might have been avoided if Hitler had been willing to trust his professional military advisors and allow them to make operational decisions based on actual battlefield conditions, rather than Hitler's ideological fantasies about the power of will to overcome material disadvantages. The pattern established during the winter of 1941 would repeat itself with tragic consequences in subsequent campaigns, most notably at Stalingrad in winter 1942 through 43, when Hitler again refused to authorize tactical withdrawals that could have saved the Sixth Army from encirclement and destruction. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of Sixth Army, found himself in exactly the same position as von Bock, Guderian, and the other generals who had been purged during the previous winter, knowing that his army needed to break out of the Soviet encirclement immediately, while such breakout was still militarily possible, but also knowing that requesting permission to withdraw would almost certainly result in denial, and possibly in his relief from command for lacking the necessary determination to hold positions at all costs. Paulus chose obedience over sound military judgment, and the result was the destruction of an entire army, and the death or capture of over 250,000 German soldiers in the greatest single defeat suffered by the Wehrmacht during the entire war. The generals who had been relieved during the winter of 1941 faced uncertain futures in a regime that viewed professional military dissent as tantamount to treason. Guderian would eventually be recalled to service in early 1943 as Inspector General of Panzer Forces, a position that utilized his technical expertise while keeping him away from field command, where his independent judgment might again conflict with Hitler's operational directives. Höppner would be arrested after the July 20th assassination attempt, despite having no direct involvement in the plot, and would be executed on August 8, 1944, after a show trial before the People's Court, paying the ultimate price for his earlier disobedience and his suspected sympathies with officers who had attempted to remove Hitler from power. Von Rundstedt would be recalled to command in the West, where he would preside over the Atlantic Wall defenses and later the failed attempt to repel the Normandy invasion in June 1944. But his relationship with Hitler remained strained by the memory of his relief during the winter crisis and by Hitler's continuing suspicion that von Rundstedt lacked sufficient offensive spirit and determination. Von Bock would never receive another field command after his relief in December 1941, effectively ending the career of one of Germany's most experienced Army Group commanders at a time when such experience was desperately needed as Germany faced increasingly difficult military situations on multiple fronts. The human cost of Hitler's refusal to permit tactical withdrawals during the winter of 1941 through 42 can be measured not only in the immediate casualties suffered by units forced to hold untenable positions, but also in the long-term degradation of German military effectiveness that resulted from destroying the professional competence and independent judgment of the officer corps. The German army that emerged from the winter crisis was fundamentally different from the Wehrmacht that had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, having lost not only hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers and enormous quantities of irreplaceable equipment, but also having suffered permanent damage to its command culture and professional military tradition that had been built up over decades, and that had been the source of Germany's military effectiveness in the early years of the war. Military historians studying the German performance on the Eastern Front have identified Hitler's winter 1941 purge of generals as a critical turning point that helps explain why German forces, despite often maintaining tactical and technical superiority over Soviet forces throughout much of the war, were ultimately unable to prevent strategic defeat. An army whose commanders are selected primarily for political reliability rather than military competence, and who are forced to operate under a command system that punishes independent thinking and rewards blind obedience, will inevitably suffer degraded performance over time, as situations become more complex, and as opponents learn from their mistakes and develop countermeasures to previously effective tactics. The Soviet military, despite suffering from many of the same dysfunctions that plagued the German command system, including political interference in operational decisions and purges of officers suspected of disloyalty, ultimately developed a more functional relationship between political leadership and professional military commanders that allowed for greater tactical flexibility and operational innovation. The difference was that Stalin, brutal dictator though he was, recognized that he needed to empower his military professionals if he wanted to win the war, whereas Hitler never made this recognition and continued to believe until the very end that his own genius was superior to the collective expertise of his general staff and field commanders. The 35 German generals relieved of command during the winter of 1941 through 42 represented decades of accumulated military experience and professional expertise that could not be replaced by hastily promoted junior officers, regardless of how loyal or determined those junior officers might be. The loss of this experience at the highest levels of command created a permanent deficit in German military effectiveness that became increasingly apparent as the war progressed and as operational situations became more complex and demanding. By 1944 and 45, the German army was being commanded by officers who had learned that survival and advancement required telling Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than providing honest assessments of military situations, and this culture of deception and wishful thinking contributed directly to the catastrophic defeats of the final years of the war, when German forces were repeatedly caught unprepared by Allied and Soviet offensives that their commanders had assured Hitler could not possibly succeed. The question of whether Hitler's stand-fast order during the winter of 1941 actually prevented a catastrophic collapse comparable to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow remains debated among historians, with some arguing that the order did serve its purpose of preventing panic and maintaining some semblance of defensive lines, while others contend that controlled tactical withdrawals under professional military command would have achieved the same result with far fewer casualties and without the permanent damage to command relationships that the purge of generals created. What is clear is that Hitler's decision to relieve 35 senior commanders for requesting tactical flexibility established a pattern of civil-military relations that would characterize the remainder of the war, and that would contribute significantly to Germany's ultimate defeat by creating a command system that was fundamentally dysfunctional and incapable of responding effectively to the complex operational challenges of modern warfare. The generals who begged Hitler to permit retreat during the winter of 1941 were not cowards seeking to avoid combat or defeatists lacking faith in ultimate German victory. They were professional soldiers attempting to save their forces from unnecessary destruction and preserve combat power for future operations, making tactical recommendations based on decades of military experience and training, and grounded in realistic assessment of actual battlefield conditions rather than ideological fantasies about the power of will to overcome material limitations. Their relief from command and replacement by more politically reliable, but often less competent officers represented a triumph of ideology over professionalism and politics over military necessity, and the long-term consequences of this triumph would be measured in hundreds of thousands of additional German casualties and in the ultimate defeat of a military force that had begun the war as perhaps the most effective fighting machine in the world, but that ended the war as a hollow shell commanded by officers who had learned that survival required submission to Hitler's will rather than exercise of independent military judgment. The winter of 1941 through 42 established the template for German military operations for the remainder of the war, with Hitler's control over operational decisions becoming increasingly absolute, and with the professional military's ability to influence strategic and tactical decisions becoming progressively more constrained. The generals who survived the Winter Purge learned the lesson that Hitler intended them to learn. Obedience would be rewarded, and independent judgment would be punished, regardless of whether that obedience led to military success, and regardless of whether that independent judgment was based on sound professional analysis. This lesson, learned at such terrible cost during the winter crisis outside Moscow, would echo through every subsequent campaign until the final collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945, when the chickens finally came home to roost, and the consequences of Hitler's destruction of his own command system became impossible to ignore even by the most devoted believers in the Führer's military genius. The legacy of the winter 1941 command crisis extends beyond purely military considerations into broader questions about leadership, obedience, and the relationship between professional expertise and political authority in modern states. The German generals who faced the choice between obeying Hitler's stand-fast order and making tactical decisions based on their professional judgment were confronting a fundamental dilemma that recurs throughout history whenever political leaders attempt to exercise direct control over military operations without possessing the necessary expertise or understanding of battlefield realities. The military tradition in most Western democracies has evolved to include strong norms of civilian control over the military, combined with delegation of operational authority to professional commanders who are expected to exercise independent judgment within the framework of political objectives set by elected leaders. But Nazi Germany represented a different model, where the political leader claimed absolute authority over every aspect of military operations, including tactical details that normally would have been left to commanders on the scene. The 35 generals relieved during the winter crisis faced professional and personal ruin for attempting to exercise the kind of operational judgment that would have been considered not only acceptable, but mandatory in most professional military organizations, and their fate serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when political loyalty becomes the primary criterion for military advancement, and when professional competence becomes subordinate to ideological conformity. The Wehrmacht that emerged from the winter crisis was no longer the professional military force that had existed before the invasion of the Soviet Union, but had become something closer to a political army, where commanders survived not through successful performance of military missions, but through successful navigation of political relationships and careful avoidance of anything that might be interpreted as dissent or defeatism by a supreme commander who could not tolerate any suggestion that his judgment might be flawed or his orders might be wrong. The human cost of this transformation cannot be calculated precisely, but certainly runs into the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who died unnecessarily in subsequent campaigns because their commanders had learned that obedience to Hitler's orders was more important than sound tactical decision-making, and that requesting permission to conduct sensible military operations like tactical withdrawals or defensive repositioning would result in relief from command rather than authorization to proceed. The Sixth Army's destruction at Stalingrad, the failed offensive at Kursk in summer 1943, the catastrophic collapse in Normandy in summer 1944, and countless smaller disasters throughout the final years of the war can all be traced in part to the dysfunctional command relationships established during the winter of 1941, when Hitler purged his generals for having the courage to tell him the truth about battlefield conditions and request authorization for military operations that conflicted with his ideological convictions about the necessity of holding every meter of ground and never retreating under any circumstances. The winter of 1941 through 42 stands as one of the decisive moments of the Second World War, not because of any single battle or campaign, but because of what it revealed about the fundamental nature of Nazi Germany's command system and the relationship between Hitler and his military commanders. The generals who begged Hitler to permit retreat were shot not with bullets, but with career destruction and personal humiliation. And their sacrifice served as a warning to every other German officer that professional military judgment would not be tolerated if it conflicted with the Führer's will, establishing a pattern that would contribute significantly to Germany's ultimate defeat and to the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who deserved better leadership than what they received from a political system that valued obedience over competence and ideology over military professionalism.